The Game Boy library is full of fun adventures waiting to be had, and over the past couple of years, I've found some real standouts that I would easily place as the best of what I've played so far. Great Greed, Survival Kids, and Legend of the River King are a few I'd recommend in a heartbeat, but after trying out Final Fantasy Adventure, it's easy to add a fourth to that short list. For this playthrough, I enjoyed the game in a couple of ways. First was via the magic of the Super Game Boy on the Super Nintendo, but I also played a chunk of it on original hardware. We used a modified Game Boy Color setup with a controller and recorded the screen with a zoom camera. I hope you enjoyed the 2 video feeds for the review. Final Fantasy Adventure follows the quest of a young man that I named Gry. In his attempts to learn more about the malevolent plans of a group called the Glaive, he attempted to infiltrate their castle but was captured and forced into slavery under the reign of their leader, Dark Lord. Not the Dark Lord, just someone named Dark, last name Lord. I found this amusing. Anyway, in order to get their daily food rations, the slaves were forced into combat with great beasts and suffered many injuries, sometimes fatal ones. One day, after discovering his best friend Willie in his final moments, our hero was asked to deliver an urgent message to a stranger who just happens to be one of the last living members of a warrior group called the Geminites. These brave men defended the Mana Tree in a previous triumph over evil, and it's up to you to deliver the message to stop the Glaive and Dark Lord from harnessing the Mana Tree's power for nefarious purposes. If this backstory wasn't already captivating enough, there are plenty of elements that deepen its impact even further. One is the articulate writing. Other than a couple of grammatical and spelling errors here and there, the majority of the game had a solid translation. Much of the dialogue was quite powerful in its storytelling ability. I will say that there was a notable dip in quality after the game's halfway point, but it didn't dampen the experience since the story's intentions weren't completely lost. So many of the people you meet in your travels are dealing with some very serious problems, and the sound writing allowed me to really feel for them. In so many other games, I spend so much of my time reading between poorly translated lines, attempting to understand what exactly is going on, but that wasn't an issue here at all. I was even moved a few times, especially by this one's ending, and a big contributor to the emotional punches was the absolutely fantastic soundtrack. Aside from the very repetitive dungeon music, most of the adventuring and many big story moments were accompanied by what I'd describe as a brilliant soundtrack. The upbeat and hopeful nature of the overworld music, as well as the sorrowful tunes that played as someone was gearing up to blink and disappear forever, were perfect, and I wouldn't really change a thing. Another huge plus is that the cast of characters you encounter are fairly well developed, which was a pleasant surprise. They have personal and important motivations for wanting to help you, rather than just derailing your progress with pointless side quests. The segments involving these characters hover relatively close to the main storyline, keeping the experience focused. I didn't ever feel like the game was being padded out arbitrarily just for the sake of making it longer. Even though what you do with these folks would still technically qualify as side quests, they all directly advance the plot in meaningful ways rather than dealing with nonsense like finding materials or workers to fix a broken bridge you need to cross to get to the next area. There's only 2 small gripes I have about the townspeople here, and the first is how eager they are to strike up a chat with you. If even a single pixel of your character's sprite grazes them as you walk by, a conversation's initiated whether you want it or not. Like characters in many other games, they never really move around in a way that's predictable to try to avoid them. In the tight confines of towns with narrow passageways between buildings, I regularly found myself trapped or cornered with no way out. Even my best planned escapes were often thwarted, and I'd have to spend what I'd consider an unreasonable amount of time waiting for opportunities for freedom. It's bad enough that the text boxes are always exactly the same every time you speak to a character, but even worse is how unreasonably slow the text pace is. You can hold a button to speed it up, but it's laughable how little extra speed you get. The best fix for all of this would have been requiring a button press to speak to someone. Even without that, some text variation, a jump button, or even a way to shove townspeople out of the way would have gone a long way to ease that tedium. The second issue is that people occasionally straight up mislead you. The most egregious examples come from a character giving directions that conveniently left out important details. I was told at one point to travel east and then go north to find a town, but there was no indication of how far east or north I had to go. There were a surprising number of ways to interpret this hint, and the ambiguity led me to wander around for far longer than I care to admit. And please don't even get me started on the palm trees and 8 puzzle. While I think the convolutedness with that one is due to a translation error, the issue is still pretty notorious. I stumbled into the solution for it completely by accident. When someone in my livestream chat revealed to me what I'd done to solve it, it actually blew my mind. I won't spoil it for you here, but the solution was far outside of anything I'd normally consider trying. The game and all its exploration takes place from the top-down perspective, and through, Final Fantasy Adventure is an action RPG. You gain experience by felling monsters, raise your stats with each level, and find a variety of weapon and equipment upgrades along your travels. It's almost textbook in many ways, but has some unique aspects that set it apart from other games. First of all, there's quite a bit of choice to be found in the weapon slate. You start off the game with a sword that has little more than poking range, but you'll eventually gain access to stronger and longer hitting weapons like axes, whips, and maces. I loved the variety here, and even if things like the whips hit for less than some of the closer ranged weapons, I tended to stick to them for the convenience of staying out of harm's way. Compared to other games that I've played in this style, Final Fantasy Adventure's combat was actually fun. I never really felt overcrowded or that I was taking on damage unfairly due to eaten inputs or poor aiming ability. The majority of my issues came from my own mistakes or clever enemy patterns I hadn't learned yet. The game also touts the same charging attack meter from the later mana games in the series, though outside of a few boss fights, most enemies didn't require waiting for a full charge to attack. But if there was an enemy I really wanted to teach a lesson, you bet I waited for that meter to be charged up. The weapons were also used in other interesting ways while exploring the fields. Some could be employed to cross chasms or remove things blocking the path like trees or rocks. I loved this idea in principle, but in practice, switching between them became overwhelming very quickly. While it was satisfying seeing what trees could be chopped down to reveal a path the first time through a screen, having to swap between a preferred fighting weapon and one needed to clear a passage so often bogged down the flow of the experience a little. On top of the exploration requirements, some kinds of enemies were immune to certain weapon types, forcing even more shuffling. I've only seen this sort of thing in the context of elemental weaknesses and resistances with magic, or in some cases, elemental weapons like in Crystallis on NES. Here though, I thought it was a little silly that an enemy wouldn't be damaged by a sword, but could easily be killed with a whip instead. It's not even like there were any specific tells about what weapon to use the first time you saw an enemy either. You just had to smack them with whatever you had equipped, listen for the immunity noise, and then try something else until something worked. There were some stretches of the game where there were resistant enemies on adjacent screens, or even on the same one. After a while, instead of fiddling with my menus every few seconds, I started ignoring some of the monsters instead. I try not to do this too often in RPGs, since every killed enemy is one step closer to a new level, but here it was just too much work for the handful of gil and experience I'd be rewarded with. Speaking of rewards, there wasn't much of that to be had for exploring around. I very rarely, if ever, found secrets out and about on the overworld. That's not to say that there aren't any to find, but despite being as thorough as I could be, I didn't run across any, unless you count extraneous shops or inns. Even later on in the game, when I was able to travel around the world more freely, there were no good reasons really to backtrack to earlier areas again, since nothing changed. I wish the exploration would have been slightly deeper than it was. It really boils down to personal preference for me, but I feel like without that extra bit of content, Final Fantasy Adventure falls a bit short in my books compared to other things I've played. Anyway, there's an in-game map you can access through the menu that I found pretty useless. It only shows the few towns and where you are relative to them, but the physical one included with the game is actually fantastic. It shows where towns and other places are too, but also highlights geographical details that you'll need for getting around later on when the world opens up a little bit. On its reverse was a reference guide with essential information and stats about items, magic, and equipment. I like when this stuff's included in the manual, but sadly, it's almost entirely missing from there in this case. Having it on the back of the map is better than nothing though. Since we're on the topic of items, I suppose now would be a good time to mention the abysmal inventory situation. Final Fantasy Adventure has so many great tools, many of which are one-time use versions of magic or even various types of cures for status ailments. The problem is that your inventory is extremely cramped since you can only carry a maximum of 16 things at any time. You can buy items in small stacks, but you can't stack those at all. If you want to carry 6 potions, for example, they come in sets of 2, and each set will take up its own precious inventory slot. This meant that I couldn't carry a lot of the things I wanted or needed to. And I had to be extremely choosy with what I took along with me. Because of these limits, the upside was that I felt encouraged to actually use my consumables to make room for new stuff to try. The downside was that I didn't really get the chance to use items often because I just didn't need to. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, your HP and MP are completely restored every time you level up. I didn't hesitate to slam down potions in boss fights when I was getting clobbered, but for the most part, I tried my best to hold out for a level up unless I was on the brink of death. Another thing was that most status effects here are temporary, so it didn't make sense to carry stuff to cure each one of them. The only really scary status was poison, which seemed to take off an unreasonable amount of health per second, but things like stone and darkness didn't last very long at all. That's not to say that having a few softs to cure petrification didn't save my butt a few times. Some enemies were relentless, and there were a handful of situations where I got caught in a stone stun lock and needed an item to bail myself out. Getting mooged was the only other truly nerve-wracking thing since your defenses plummet, but carrying restoratives for that's pointless anyway since you can't use items when you're moogled. All of this aside, the biggest reason I didn't rely on consumables much was the magic system. Once you start getting into some of the important spells like curing and healing, item use is rendered almost entirely obsolete. MP cost is so cheap, and in late game, magic far outpaced the effects of any item I had in my inventory. I think the most significant drawback of such a small carrying capacity is that there are mandatory items that permanently take up an inventory slot. You can't do without keys or Maddox for a significant portion of the game, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I'd also like to point out that there are quite a few quest objects that don't disappear once they're used that, you guessed it, stay put in your inventory for the whole game. If you're wondering why I didn't just sell some of this stuff off, I'm now conditioned to cling to these sorts of things given my soft-locking blunder in Final Fantasy Legend. In that playthrough, I dropped a story-related item that I still needed and wasn't able to get another one, so I became irreversibly locked out of progressing any further. I wasn't willing to relive that here, and ended up hanging on to 2 or 3 special keys that I wasn't sure I should sell, which shrunk my inventory capacity even further. I felt it was much safer to err on the side of caution. Another thing that having a perpetually full inventory affected was opening up chests when they appeared. The game's actually super generous with how often enemies drop loot, and another neat tidbit is that the same ones always drop the same stuff. If you're in need of keys, for example, you just have to fight off the same skeleton spawns until they appear for you. But anyway, when your inventory's full, the chest just prompts a text box letting you know that. If the chest's blocking a path, you either had to drop something to pick up its contents, or you had to leave the room and spawn a new enemy, and hopefully kill it in a more convenient location. This wasn't the end of the world, but it was pretty annoying in rooms where there wasn't a lot of space to move around in. Inventory issues also nearly caused me to soft-lock my game. I mentioned earlier that there are items that you must keep on you at all times when moving through a dungeon, and those are keys and Maddox. Well, the problem is that once you've unlocked a door or broken down a wall, the passages magically reseal themselves if you wander too far away. And unless you have more of those consumables to open the path up again on your next pass, you can't go back again. In my case, while exploring, I'd used my last key and realized too late that I'd taken a path that had a second locked door further on down the line that I couldn't open. I couldn't go forward, and I couldn't go back either. The game lets you save anywhere you like and as often as you like. Unfortunately for me, I'd saved beyond a point of no return, but thankfully I had also saved in the second save slot prior to beginning the dungeon, so I was able to reload and play again from there. If I hadn't, I would have had to start the game over again. The second save slot was a total lifesaver compared to other experiences that don't offer that luxury, but I'm still really sorry to Luke and all of his game progress that I overwrote. I'm sure if he happens to see this video, he'll know it was for the greater good of my playthrough. Now, I think based on the target audience back when this was released, the choices to implement a tiny inventory and only 2 save slots were a bit cruel. As someone who's played games for decades by now, I've been burned by enough RPGs to be highly paranoid about losing my progress. Consequently, I save often and think pretty heavily about when and where I'm making those saves. For the target demographic though, I doubt kids taking their Game Boys out in the 90s would have been as attentive or considerate of the possibility of a soft lock. And while I was live streaming Final Fantasy Adventure, I lost track of the number of people coming into chat saying that that's exactly what happened to them. When they were little, they got stuck in a dungeon somewhere without any consumables and gave up because they didn't feel like starting over again. That's not to mention losing progress because of dead batteries, or even stuff that happens in kids' lives like getting called for supper and having to save right away without taking stock of the number of keys you have before going to eat. Even something like Defenders of Oasis on the Game Gear auto-saved after every action in case your batteries died. But here, the developers didn't work in many helpful contingencies for their players. I think many more people would have seen this game's beautiful ending if these aspects were taken into account. Even with some risky gameplay design, the dungeons in Final Fantasy Adventure were satisfying to figure out. One big plus is that the game conveniently automaps for you, which saved me a lot of trouble trying to make my own. These places were extremely puzzle-heavy, but the puzzles themselves weren't anything too troublesome. I was actually impressed at how many teachable moments this game imparts upon new players. The first time you run into a new obstacle, there's a clever experience that shows you what to do, whether it's learning how to search for false walls or using a chest to trigger a door switch. These strategies are all outlined in the manual too, but it was great being shown in a way that didn't make me feel like I was being beaten over the head with the instructions. I really missed that kind of subtlety. For many of the larger dungeons, you also got a comrade that came along to help. They were extremely useful since they not only helped fight the good fight, but they also had their own secondary abilities if you used the ask function in the menu. I didn't realize this until deep into my playthrough, but depending on who you have along, they might restore some health, top up your MP, or cure a status ailment for you. And as far as I could tell, you could use this as often as you wanted with no limit. The only time I found the tag-along people bothersome was when they got in the way of my puzzle solving. One such example was a dungeon where I needed to freeze a couple of enemies and push their frozen bodies onto switches to open a door. While freezing them was just fine, my partner would inevitably kill them before I could get the other person placed. There's no way to dismiss them either, so it was a matter of getting lucky and working quickly to keep moving forward. Their loyalty and desire to keep me alive first and foremost was admirable, but sometimes I just wanted to shove them in a corner for a few minutes while I did my thing. In terms of the game's difficulty, I didn't really run into much trouble at all, aside from my near miss with soft locking. I think because it was a typical first playthrough for me with no hints or spoilers, I spent a lot of time wandering around fighting extra monsters and gaining levels, which made stretches of the game pretty breezy. I didn't ever need to grind, but there was one boss encounter that totally pulled the rug out from under me. I spontaneously ran into this lich fellow, and he absolutely wrecked me. This was one of a handful of times where I experienced a game over. Otherwise, boss fights were very predictable, with several of the later ones repeating simple patterns from those that showed up earlier on in the adventure. I did find charged up attacks and magic for these fights very useful, but with a little memorization, it would have been pretty easy to beat them without all of the bells and whistles. Final Fantasy Adventure was an extremely pleasant experience. I really enjoyed its story and characters first and foremost, and its soundtrack has been jammed in my head since I finished playing. With its fun and fluid combat, as well as some intricate dungeon design, it stands apart from other similar titles, not only in just the Game Boy library, but other systems from around the same time of release. Some aspects of the game could have used an overhaul, like the inventory limitations and the perilous saving situation, but the biggest thing that would have pushed this over the top for me would have been more rewarding exploration. Even as it stands, it's still easily near the top of my favorite experiences on the Game Boy. If I'd had this one as a kid, I don't think I would have been able to put it down.